So this is the director's cut. We were just talking on the sidelines about the role that Bitcoin can or cannot play as a challenger to the core system. If the core system is corrupt, and this is very much part of the narrative that people go for, in that they are disappointed with the standing system, is there a justification for some sort of challenger system, maybe in a limited way between sovereign states, or as a collateral mechanism that keeps everyone in check? But in that context, I was just saying that El Salvador kind of proves to be the counter argument, in that Bitcoin in that particular circumstance is being used as a form of repression. But Ben, you were telling me that there's other examples of how crypto can be used in a repressive way, not just as this symbol of resistance and challenge against the core system.
Right. So if you look at the only two countries in the world that have actually adopted it as legal tender, El Salvador and the Central African Republic. We've covered El Salvador, but the Central African Republic, which we've not had the opportunity to go to yet, I really do have a dream of going to the Central African Republic, is interesting because from what I understand, the Central African Republic, a very poor country, 90% of the population does not have internet access. So how in the world are they going to use Bitcoin? Well, maybe the point is not actually for them to use Bitcoin. Perhaps, just taking a wild guess, it might have something to do with corruption. Again, the ideals of, well, I struggle with this. So I think there's a temptation to say the ideals of Bitcoin are laudable, in that people transacting directly with one another is good. And I do think it's an interesting idea. The problem, of course, that I come back to from my economics training is, what is money? We made it up, right? It doesn't exist. And it's a social construct. It requires, just like government or religion, it requires a certain critical mass to believe in it for it to work. And when people lose faith in the currency, the governments collapse, the currencies collapse, the economies collapse. In the United States and the UK, we've been privileged not to experience that, certainly recently, but we're not immune from it. I think it's no coincidence to me. So in that sense, money is based on trust. It both requires trust to exist, and then it requires trust to continue to fulfill its purpose. And when the trust breaks down, the currencies break down. It's no coincidence to me that trust is really at its low point in American society, and potentially even globally over the last several decades. You know, we should not take lightly the spread of misinformation, the viral spread of misinformation, the spread of a breakdown in trust between not just the people and their government, or the peoples and their governments, but between one another. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. Social media is one of them, misinformation, but it is also about sort of a breakdown in democracy and a breakdown in the rule of law, and it's sort of a real corruption at its core. And I think if we can address some of those issues, I think we're more likely to address the issues of trust in money.
Well, I think the cypherpunks would argue that that's what they anticipated happening, that there would be this massive breakdown in trust, and that the internet, rather than being entirely a force for good, would also be a mechanism by which, there could be exponential, lies being told. So, there's no in an open market, there's no, there isn't a cap on how many lies you can tell, right? So in that context, I guess the idea was that Bitcoin provided the only solid proof of like truth, and hence the trust could be, absorbed into Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin could be used to kind of rebuild a trust-based system. That would be the cypherpunk. I mean, I'm probably doing a terrible rendition of their views, but do you think in the context of that sort of absolute kind of distortion of reality and lies and truth, there might be an aspect of some sort of logic in Bitcoin as this sort of truth machine, because you can't, theoretically amend it, and it's, immutable and all that malarkey?
No, I mean, the notion of a trustless currency to me is exactly backwards.
Mhm.
A currency can only exist out of trust. It's a shared delusion. We I gave you this piece of paper with green markings on it, or whatever. Forget the currencies over there. What colors do you have? Just a piece of paper. What's it backed by? Well, in our case, the largest economy in the world, an incredibly powerful military machine as well, not to be discounted. I'm not saying it's pretty, but it has worked better than anything we've tried. And by the way, we have tried private money. I've been studying the wildcat banking era of the 19th century. And while I think I mischaracterized it earlier, not here, but previously speaking, before I'd done as much research as I probably should have, it wasn't an unmitigated disaster, but it didn't work very well. All of these state banks were set up, chartered by the state governments with some backing in state bonds, but allowed to issue their own currencies. And many of them failed. And their fraud was also a big problem. Some of the states fared better than others. But the notion that we should even aspire to private currency is really, it's terrifying to me a bit. I mean, to be blunt. I mean, I visited the largest crypto mine in the United States, Whinstone, just outside of Austin, when I was at South by earlier this year. And massive warehouses are running all of these machines, consuming enormous amounts of energy to produce these speculative assets. So you would like the multi-billion-dollar corporations to control the money supply at enormous environmental cost, rather than the shared delusion of the government. I'm not sure that putting more power in the hands of corporations is really the answer. I think it actually ironically gets you right back to what crypto was supposed to address to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I continuously see sort of crypto making the same old mistakes that core finance, has made, and it just ends up sort of turning into a badder version of the original, right? But I wonder, like in the broader sense, whether is there an argument that there is room for all these sorts of experimental currencies and state ones? Because at the end of the day, the state, if the state currency is the better and more efficient currency in a market, in a free market, Bitcoins and cryptos shouldn't in theory, be able to attract any use case other than in, say, the speculative bubble sense. If core kind of fiat currency is doing its job, is there any downside other than the energy footprint from having these other kind of challenges in the system?
Yeah, the downside is fraud. Because you've set up a parallel financial structure free of regulation, most people have lost their money. That will probably continue. And then once you put regulation into it, once you actually have to play by the rules, well, what does it do? What are the use cases of cryptocurrency? Like, what does it actually do? When I asked Sam Bankman-Fried that question, he said payments. He said payments, which I have to say was quite amusing to me. I mean, you're going back to the beginning to, the 2008 white paper, but crypto's not being used for payments. Do you go to your cafe and pay with Bitcoin? And it's not because it hasn't been adopted enough. That's another fallacy. It's that the proof of work is too environmentally, it doesn't work very well. 7 transactions a second.
Yeah, it's not efficient, and it's incredibly costly. Hence why, fiat currency, any centralized system will always, I imagine, outcompete far more energy. Even the proof of stake stuff. Obviously, Ethereum is moving from proof of
Proof of work to proof of stake.
Proof of work to proof of stake. But I don't think that's going to really make a difference. I was wondering, Ben, in your research, had you come across this chap called Sergei Mavrodi, who was like the arch Ponzi schemer after the fall of communism in the USSR? I think you'd find it a fascinating story.
This is What's it
I know
called?
the bare outlines of this one. Isn't he back in East Africa now or somewhere doing kind of the
He
same
actually
thing?
passed away a couple of years ago,
Oh, okay.
but he was back. He came back in 2011. But the story is fascinating. I think it really speaks to the moment right now, because obviously USSR was coming out of it was engaged in a paradigm shift, an economic paradigm shift at that time. And a lot of people who previously were not very aware of how financial markets worked were suddenly plunged into having to fend for themselves in the free market. And Mavrodi kind of came along and again created this incredibly compelling narrative about how you can't trust the core system is all corrupt, and buy into my Ponzi scheme, and you can have the riches that everybody else has. And then when the fascinating thing about the story is that eventually, when his scheme got busted, he managed to convince the public that it wasn't his fault, it was the government's fault. And then he did a kind of election campaign and got elected into the Duma as some sort of official. I don't know his specific role, getting immunity as in the process. So he kind of used the whole network structure of the Ponzi scheme to hack democracy itself. And the promise he'd made to people was that once he was in power, he would then distribute the tax payments to all the people he defrauded. It was absolutely genius in some ways, but I think it kind of is the cautionary tale of our time. And it also reminds me a little bit of what Pablo Escobar did himself. Again, a kind of another Robin Hood kind of character. And that, I think, is the key story that you keep hearing over and over again. It's this Robin Hood mentality of it's okay if we steal from the rich to give to the poor. Does that resonate? What do you think?
Well, unfortunately, this is stealing from the poor to give to the rich. I mean,
exactly
is the problem. Any Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme. It's like it's all these people at the bottom going this way. And to be honest with you, it is a little bit more complicated in this case, because if you had originally believed in cryptocurrency and gotten in early, let's say you invested, prior to say 2016, certainly, you have made an enormous amount of money. And so that I think really is where the rationalization comes in. And I want to be clear, in this context, I'm not saying fraud, because I'm not saying that they intended ever to commit or have any bad intentions necessarily. Some of them, quite frankly, do, but many don't. It's that it's very hard if you've made millions of dollars on paper. But again, remember how we're denominating this, millions of dollars, because you were early in something that happened to take on this speculative fervor, because it could be treated as somewhat of a store of value, as an investment rather than as a currency. And that's why you're not using it as a currency. If you've made $1 billion in Bitcoin, you're not going around handing out Bitcoins at the deli to get your bagel and coffee. So yeah, I just think that so much of this actually involves storytelling and human psychology, how we kind of think about things. And it's quite easy to make that jump between this is bad, so I should just try this. I'll just try something else, because I agree with this guy who's telling me something's bad. The same guy who used, funnily enough, the guy who used the same argument with me, Alex Mashinsky, the CEO of Celsius, used the same argument with me at South by Southwest when I interviewed him. He said, we're a bank, but we're better than a bank. You can't trust the banks. They screw you over. They've now filed for Chapter 11, and hundreds of thousands of people have lost their money.
It is ironic that is the key message that you always hear. So just to finish off, I'm because you're an actor, do you think that there's, so often Hollywood does sort of play a role in part in values and educational lessons to the consciousness of the masses? Would you like to see, Hollywood play a role in some of the solutions? Because some of this is educational, and I think a really good sort of fictional narrative, would be incredibly powerful, perhaps more powerful, like a Top Gun style 2 film, might be more impactful than any regulation that comes out of the SEC or CFTC. What do you think?
I'm working on a documentary.
That's a
I've
good
got
way.
screenplay ideas.
No, we have. I've been recording my adventures. So that's all I can do. I mean, I agree. Theoretically that Hollywood would play a role, but remember, Hollywood is in response, right? Hollywood is reacting to the overall economic structure and incentive structure. So when the crypto companies came to the agencies, they didn't say, thank you for your offer of millions and millions of dollars for almost no work for our clients and for us, but we're going to pass. We want to educate the public, we know the economic issues at stake, and it's just not going to happen. What will happen, I suspect, or I hope, I guess I should say, I can't predict it, but what will happen is a pushback, a serious pushback, because you can't screw over tens of millions of people. At this point, if you believe the Pew study that 16% of Americans have ever bought cryptocurrency, have ever used it or bought it or hold it now, then that's 40 million Americans. And the majority have lost money because we know the majority entered in 2021. That's coming from the crypto company's own research, from Grayscale's December 2021 research that found over half of Bitcoin investors invested in 2021. So they all came in the bubble, and the majority did, and they've lost money. Now, most of them have lost a little bit of money, hopefully, not too much, but some have lost everything. You can fool them for a while, but eventually people get upset about it, and they do care about it. And if the rule of law and if democracy has any meaning whatsoever, then there will be, if not hell to pay, some very polite taps on the wrist for all of these fancy people who we couldn't possibly put in jail. I think that's the cleansing nature of it. It's sort of like the virus, like we develop an immunity to it, is kind of the way it is. It's just come at great cost. That's the positive version. The negative version is, it gets into the banking system and in a way that's not regulated properly, and it keeps going. I don't have anything against people gambling. I think that gambling is fine. I like a little light gambling myself, or used to. I had a life, full wife and kids. But you should gamble in a regulated casino is my only advice. Gambling in an unregulated casino is not a good use of your time, in my opinion.
I do like this immunization comparative, and I do think, though, that movies play a role in that immunization, and that often they can influence people not to do things that they might otherwise have done. It'll be interesting to see where the narrative goes from here. Just looking forward, then, last words. So you've got your book coming out in 2023. What else is on your radar? Is there anything else that we should be watching for?
Yeah, we're working on a podcast and a documentary. We're doing all the things. We have got a lot of research. We've got a lot of reporting that we've done. A lot of stuff that has yet to be revealed to the public. Interviews with notable figures. And I think it's important stuff for the public to hear. I think that so much of the conversation in terms of the media works from everyone benefiting from crypto going up, and the media companies would benefit from advertising on their sites that would lead them to covering the space, that would lead them to having a certain kind of often a perspective on the space. I'm not saying there's been incredible journalism on crypto. There are many, many great journalists. You have a number of them, including yourself, in taking part in the symposium. But overall, crypto benefited wildly from sort of the concentration of media and the media's, incentive structures. Again, an incentive structure to just kind of go along with it and talk about, isn't this amazing? Everyone made all of this money overnight. It's incredible. What's it based on? Oh, don't worry about that. They're securities, but they don't actually have a revenue stream or do anything. No, don't worry about that part. It's just amazing. I think that as this goes on, you will see somewhat of the reverse in play. It's not usually a sustainable business to keep screwing over your own customers. Like at some point, unless you have a monopoly, which is, I guess, the argument against fiat currencies, But unless you have a monopoly, it's quite difficult to keep that business going because people will just go somewhere else. They'll just leave the casino. They'll, go gamble in Vegas instead.
Yes. So basically, the end message I would take away from all that is we need to focus more on the positive sum and less on the negative sum, or even, I mean, zero sum, negative sum. It's arguable, but I think you might even side with the notion it's all negative sum in the crypto sphere. But thank you so much both for joining me in this extra little edition. And I look forward to keeping an eye on what you both produce, and I'll definitely be buying your book when it comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Izabella.
Thanks so much.